Does anybody ever send you stuff saying, I think you'd be interested in this? Or does anything come to you, or do you find it?
People occasionally do, but nothing has ever come of those ones. It seems to me that I need to find them. I go to local museums and I just, browse, keep an eye out for things.
You go to local museums?
If I'm in, a city, like on book tour, I'll go to the history museum, I don't know, or I remember one short story I wrote for a previous collection. It was inspired by a picture caption. I was in a stately home and there was a very unusual painting of two girls, equally elegant and beautiful, and one was black and one was white, which is not the usual way that black people were represented in 18th century art, so I thought, who are they? So, that inspired a whole story. So I just keep an eye out somehow. I don't know, it's a habit. But the reason that the notes are after each story in a prominent place is because when I did my first collection of historical short stories, my editor at the time at Virago, I said to her, I'll hide the notes at the end because only graduate students would be interested. And she said, no, the public have a taste for reality, you must bring it up front. And I felt slightly embarrassed, I said, well, you can't go straight from the fiction to the fact. And she said, well, put them on the next page. So she's absolutely right. I think people are very interested in the fact for a number of reasons. Not only do they have this, hunger to know what happened next, but often they're curious about your process as well. And in a way, I'm just trying to be very upfront and transparent about what I'm doing. And also, I feel responsible to these ghosts. They're my dead. I'm intimate with each of them. So I feel like I don't want my short story with its fictionalizations to be the only way that they last in popular culture. I want to say, here are the facts. You go and read about them. You write your own story. So I'm trying to, in a way, share my materials with readers and let my story be a launching point for further things that they might read or write. I don't have ownership of these, but I do feel responsible for, helping to resurrect them.
Now, the stories span, are you ready, 400 years. Did you think about changing styles depending on what era you were writing about, or did you decide?
Yeah, the styles, of course, it depends what mode you're writing in. If you write in third person, it's very sort of freeing. If you're saying he or she, you don't have to write exactly the way your character would speak, but you still have to try and capture the kind of mindset of the time and often the rhythms of their speech, even if you're saying he or she. If you choose to write in the first person, then you have to come up with something much more like a document of the time, though again, it's always sort of halfway between then and now. So for instance, the oldest story in the book, I chose to make it a diary because it was about this Puritan settler in Massachusetts, and I loved the idea that, every now and then he would jot down 3 lines, so one of these really concise diaries where, there's a lot of pain and complexity in between the lines. He'll write something like, God has not yet granted me a wife. And you think, oh, there's been a lot going on, So in that case, it was really important to me to make it diary and to show his language being utterly biblical, that this man is steeped in what he perceives as the stern, not just the rules in the Bible, but the imagery of the Bible. Seeds are always falling on stony soil, this kind of thing. So in a way, by the time this man gets himself into a terrible muddle, basically he kept reporting on his neighbors for sex crimes. You'd think he'd have been too busy. I mean, they were a hand-to-mouth community trying not to starve, but no, he went around spying on people and accusing them of sex crimes. But in a way, by writing in his language, I was trying to show that he gets so trapped in this single way of seeing the world, sheep versus goats, evil versus good, that he can't see any subtlety. And I wrote one short story in the form of letters. It's a short story about a little girl who was fostered out because there was a big movement in the late 19th century to take poor children from East Coast cities and send them out west for the fresh air. And sometimes their parents got them back and sometimes they didn't. So I wanted to write about one particular case there for a story called The Gift. And the source I had was that the Children's Society who were arranging these adoptions or foster arrangements, and they left really minimal notes on the letters they received. So they'd say, received a letter from the girl's mother wanting to know, can she see her? Received a letter from the girl's father saying she is well. So that's all I had. I had literally a website that showed these notations. So I imagined those letters into life. So in that case, it was really important to me to create letters that would sound absolutely like the real people writing to the Children's Society. I really wanted to catch the flavour of their relationship with those bureaucrats, and how they would each try to make their case for being this girl's true parent, the birth mother and the adoptive father. And in that case, the letter format seemed perfect for me for catching all the little sort of nitty-gritties, But of course, even if you're writing historical fiction, you put in stuff from your contemporary life as well. For instance, a friend of mine recently tracked down her birth mother. My friend is in her 50s, and she waited till her adoptive mother had died before she tracked down her birth mother. And her birth mother was able to show her, for instance, a few of the letters that she'd written to the Adoption Society when she was handing over her baby, And one of the lines was something like, how's poor little Maria's constipation? And that line just killed me, the idea that you're handing over your child and you're like, hang on, can I just check how's her constipation, So I found that a heartbreaking line, and so I put that straight into this story set in the 1880s. So fiction has all sorts of sources, not just the official ones.
And some of them, I noticed the sources, Emma, are actual academic papers, so that's almost a secondary source. Is that the case? That sometimes that was true?
Yeah,
too,
sometimes,
right?
in a way, whenever you're writing either history or historical fiction, you're climbing on the shoulders of others. Academics are incredibly selfless about this, and in my experience, if you write to them wanting more information, they send you photocopies of their research, They don't tend to think in commercial terms at all. They're used to working for nothing, as it were. So I found academics to be so generous. So yeah, in the case of one particular just fascinating paper in a feminist historical anthology, I came across two of these cases. So what they usually do is quote these sources, and then you can go back to census data and so on and find what more there is. Often you're using things like, articles from very specific local history magazines. Yeah, you really never know where you're going to find good sources. You just have to develop sort of very large, flapping, elephantine ears. And some of the cases are relatively famous, like Jumbo the elephant has had a couple of biographies written about him. But I suppose if I choose to write a short story, it's because I can see an angle that would work particularly well for fiction. So I was really curious about the actual psychology of the relationship between Matthew Scott and Jumbo, and I decided I'd come in at the moment where basically in the story, Jumbo is getting sent to America. So it's a famous refused emigration. Jumbo would not get in the box, as if he knew. And lots of other people got involved, protests about don't force this English beast to go off to America. So the whole thing became very politicized. So in some cases, they're famous cases, but if I write a short story about it, it's because I think I can see a different angle.
So that the history this historical aspect of it isn't a constraint, for example?
Not a bit, no, because you don't have to cover a whole life, and you don't even always have to believe the historical source. I've often used sources that strike me as really dodgy, I remember doing a short story for a previous anthology based on this 17th century cross-dresser's memoir, and I could tell the thing was almost entirely fiction, the historical source, the apparently factual source, because I'd read a lot of memoirs and so-called memoirs of cross-dressing women, and you can see the conventions. You can almost tell from the style at the point where it's getting really, conventional. It's just like all the others. So you develop a kind of an ear for the substantiality of facts as well. So yeah, you're not always obliged to believe everything you read either. You just, you make your best educated guess, and then where there are huge gaps, you get to fill in. So the source I described of the brief notations by the Children's Society about the letters they received, that's a kind of a perfect source for me, because there's just enough to stimulate my imagination, but not so much that it gets in my way.
And in fact, I think it was about the sealed letter that you said to someone that you were researching something at the library, and you were relieved to find out that there was absolutely nothing there about it, so that you could make it up, right? It's true.
Or if you can never find a photograph of your main character, you're like, okay, this is great, I can picture him or her exactly the way I want to, And then there's very significant silences as well. For instance, yes, when I was researching the sealed letter about this notorious Victorian divorce, I once spent 2 days in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and then I went home to Chris and I said, great, I read the biography of this man and written by his sister, and she doesn't mention mention the first marriage at all. So it was clearly the divorce was such an unspeakable subject that she didn't mention it in the biography. So that's a very significant silence there.
Yeah.
So yeah, if I was an academic trying to write really substantial factual papers about all these people, I would be perceiving it as frustrating where the facts run out. But in some cases, for fiction, it's actually liberating. And also, a couple of these stories, the incident was true, or the incident was factual, but I had to make up the people. For instance, there's one short story in there about a woman who declared her husband dead during a plague in 18th century New York, and I didn't have her name or his name or the lawyer's name, so I had to make up people to go with that incident. So that is very, very freeing indeed.
Now, this set of stories also, there is a personal connection, and in fact, I highly recommend that you read the afterword. Don't leave it out. Sometimes people look at an afterwards.
What, they skip bits? Outrageous. The things readers do. And sometimes they read the end first.
Yes, but don't. And by the way, I have to say, don't read the afterword first, because there are some spoilers in it. And I should mention too that almost all of these stories have that lovely little twist, or there's something you didn't know, or that comes out at the end of it. So Emma's come perilously close, but has not yet revealed all. So know that's another element of these stories. But in the afterword, what's especially beautiful about the afterword is the way in which, Emma, you've connected your own feelings to the whole idea of feeling astray. And in fact, the opening line of the afterword is very beautiful. It just begins by saying, "I don't know where I am." Can you talk a little bit about that statement?
Yeah, I don't mean to be rude about London, Ontario. Though perhaps, I'm in Toronto, perhaps I should be, But let's just say I've ended up living in a city that really I never heard of until I moved to it. And there's nothing wrong with it, but like many emigrants, I often have this slight feeling of arbitrariness, like, why here? And you don't tend to ask that about the place you were born, because it somehow feels natural that a person from Brussels would be from Brussels. Whereas if you move cities, you often end up thinking, okay, how come, Atlanta, or how come Dubai, And sometimes it's your job that takes you there, and sometimes it's love, or sometimes it's other things, but often it just gives you this slightly, why am I here, and where is this, and why this spot on the world? So as somebody who's emigrated twice, I moved to England for 8 years and then to Canada. So I often have this slight confusion. Often when a plane is landing, I literally, for a second, don't know which fields these are, especially if I've been doing a lot of travel. So I think it's my own issues as somebody who's emigrated twice now that has made me particularly interested in migrations for this book. And I think I'm very interested in the psychology of emigration and the ways in which the emigrant, tries to have it both ways. You want to feel like you still belong to your old place, but then when you go there, you feel you have the right to complain about it and say things are actually much better in Canada. So, and I've now had the experience several times of going back to Europe for extended periods. I remember once we spent about 4 months in Dublin, and I kept complaining about the service and how rude people were in restaurants, and I thought, I've become Canadian. So you end up as neither fish nor flesh. You end up as something in the middle, perpetually spoiled for both places, really. But then whenever I'm inclined to pity myself for this, I think, well, actually for a writer, it's splendid to be unsettled in this way. Writers are never meant to be entirely insiders. We're always meant to be slightly off to one side, looking at things from a funny angle. So I think it's actually been very good for my writing that I've lived in several different places, and that I often feel not quite one of you, whatever group I'm in. So I haven't had any bad emigrations. It's just the cumulative effect of 2 emigrations often leave you feeling just a bit unsettled, literally.
And given that personal connection to this theme of your book, did you have the theme before you wrote the stories, or did you write the stories and get the theme?
I think I had written maybe 1 or 2 of the stories when I got the theme. Yeah, I remember. I think I was at a concert and I got the idea for the whole collection all in one go. I really like to write short story collections. I think short stories can become more than the sum of their parts when you shape them well in a book. I don't just when I get to half a dozen, start throwing them together, I actually like them to form a book. And I like the way the different voices in a book like this, even if they're not directly commenting on each other, they form an interesting chorus, and there are interesting contrasts between them. The basic one between people who migrate voluntarily in a sort of spirit of things are going to be so much better, and then people who do it in a desperate way or in a forced way. Very early on I was planning this book, And these short story collections, they take me a long time to grow, It's like planting an olive tree or something. You have to be very patient. But what's wonderful is that, the market for short stories is not good in general. So what's wonderful is that because this one happens to be getting published right after Room, I know it's getting a lot of attention that it wouldn't have before. So it's absolutely wonderful if, Room is like the sort of favored sibling who can share a bit of gold dust with the rest of the family.
Tell me something just a little bit about your growth as a writer. I'm always interested in asking writers when they knew that this is what they wanted to do. Did you always know? Did you write as a kid? Was there somebody who told you you've got it, or did you know you had it?
It would make a much better story if I was, downtrodden and hopeless and some great adult had spotted me. But in fact, I would say I grew up with a huge amount of confidence about writing because my father has published lots and lots of books on literature. So, in our house, I saw the surname Donoghue on many a book. And I'd go, oh yeah. And then my father would, bring home a box of books and open them. And I'd say, oh, that's clearly what you do when you're an adult. You publish books with your name on them. So, yes, I was writing poetry at 7. And I remember by about probably 11, I was thinking, I'll publish a book. For a while, I had an impression that you needed to die young and then your work be discovered, in an attic or something. But no, I always wanted to do this. I just thought I'd have to have a real job as well. What's amazing to me is that I've got away without having a real job. And it's funny, it's not like any other career, because quite often people will come up to me and say, oh, I loved your book. Are you writing anymore? And I say, yes, I don't have any other skills. This is all I have. I was fired as a chambermaid, so literally I have no other marketable skills.
And when you write, Emma, are you one of these people who are, secure as you write? So, for example, after you finish a sentence, do you look at it and go, oh, God, I'm good, Do you know it when you see it?
I would say I'm a very confident writer, but that doesn't mean I like each sentence as I write it, not a bit. But it means, in a way, I trust the project, I trust the story I'm telling. And I think it helps that a lot of my books are not directly about me. I mean, they may be in some way inspired by my experience, like emigration, but I'm not focused on, my own experience and then thinly fictionalizing it. I'm really very interested in other lives I haven't lived, experience completely foreign to mine. So in a way that keeps me focused on the goal, which is how can I bring this dead person to life again? So I'm not really thinking in ego terms when I'm writing the sentence. It's more like, okay, that one didn't work, but maybe the next one will. I'll keep piling on the sentences. My first drafts are such a mess, and they have all these bits in square brackets, like, make this funnier, check background, did this happen? Implausible question mark, remove adjectives, I'll say. So my first drafts are a complete mess, but I'm not worrying about the sentences yet. I'm worrying about the story and the character. I mean, those to me are the kind of, the bone and the muscle under the skin. And I'm not saying the words don't matter, they do, but in a way I'll get to the right words, not by fretting about the polish of the sentence early on, but by, getting the beating heart to work, and then the right words will finally line themselves up.
You say about the bones. Do you know the lay of the skeleton, shall we say, or are you one of those ruled by your characters and they tell the story to you, or do you have the art?
I'm a big planner. I see writing as a bit like, gardening, very long-term planning, or architecture, especially with a novel. I mean, the house is going to fall down if you don't think about how to keep up the fourth corner, I am a big planner. I know some writers manage to just somehow do all that in the back of their brains, and then it flows out, but in my case it wouldn't flow out. It would flow for about a page and then I would get lost. So I plan hugely, and the planning is not a cold-blooded process, It's not that you're limited by your plans. It's more you've got a structure. You've got something that, like a skeleton, it can bear weight. And then, of course, you can change things as they occur to you. I mean, there's plenty of room for improvisation in later drafts. It's just that I need to know where I'm going. For instance, some people find it hard to make up dialogue, but I always think if you know who your characters are, and above all, if you know why they are at the top of the CN Tower having this conversation on a cold day in December, if you know why they're there, then it's easy to make up what they're going to say. So I do a huge amount of thinking about my characters and of thinking about what's happening and asking myself what's going to happen in each chapter. And if the answer is not much, then maybe you don't need that chapter. So I'm trying to make myself better at plot. I don't think plot is my natural skill. I think I'm a good generator of dialogue. So I'm really trying to get better at plot by asking what happens and making sure something really does happen in each. And that doesn't have to mean big overt action. What happens can be somebody wounding somebody else's feelings, but it's still an action.